Dr. Eris Thorne stood on the precipice of the abyss. Quite literally. Below him stretched the acid flats, a chemical graveyard where the sun dared not shine through the perpetual, sickly yellow haze. It was a monument to humanity's final, desperate failure, a sprawling landscape of toxic runoff, plastic sludge, and irradiated soil, stretching farther than the eye could see. Eris, 31 years old, and already looking 50 from years spent breathing filtered air and surviving on synthetic nutrients, clutched the console of his prototype with hands that shook not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of expectation. His breath hitched as he ran the final diagnostic, the cheap plastic housing of the etheric capacitor, feeling painfully fragile against the monstrous backdrop of global ecological collapse. This was the world he was born into, a dying, choking planet where oceans were soup and the air was a commodity. The governments had long since dissolved into bickering regional consortiums, and the general public lived in deep, exhausted fatalism, just waiting for the last breath of civilization. But Eris had a secret, a relentless, burning, beautiful secret that he had nurtured in a subterranean lab for 7 years, funded by what little generational wealth his grandmother had salvaged. The device he had built, nicknamed the Clean Slate, was not a filter or a recycling unit or a containment system. It was something far more profound, a theoretical construct made real. The etheric capacitor, a sphere of polished, matte black metal barely the size of a microwave, could manipulate matter at the quantum level, not to destroy it, but to instantly render complex, harmful compounds into their most basic, inert elements. Toxic waste became sand. Carbon dioxide became pure oxygen and trace carbon dust. Nuclear fallout became harmless photons. It didn't clean the world. It simply rewound its physical entropy. He had only ever tested it on small, contained samples: a barrel of crude oil, a kilogram of plutonium, a vial of concentrated acid. Now, for the first time, he was connecting it to the entire acid flats grid. His partner, Lyra Vance, a pragmatic systems engineer with eyes that rarely showed emotion, watched him from the safety of the shielded transport vehicle 10 miles back. She was his only confidant, the person who understood the terrible genius and the terrifying risk. Lyra sent a terse message through the encrypted comms. Eris, the energy draw is going to be exponential. If the conversion matrix fails at 0.01% efficiency, we'll vaporize this whole mountain range. You know the protocols. I'm pulling the last safety fuse. Eris saw the indicator light for the emergency shutdown glow red, and then, with a barely audible click, go dark. He was alone with his creation, tethered to the largest environmental disaster zone on Earth by a series of humming power conduits that pulsed with stored solar energy. He looked down at the sheer volume of destruction below. The smell, even through his advanced atmospheric suit, was a caustic mix of sulfur, ozone, and decay that clawed at his throat. He thought of his sister, who had died of lung sickness 2 years prior, a direct casualty of the perpetual smog. That memory was the fuel for his courage. Failure was unacceptable because failure meant continuing this nightmare. He closed his eyes, took a deep, shaky breath, and activated the console. The small screen flared to life, showing the energy consumption climbing from 0 to levels that defied conventional physics. For a moment, nothing happened. The polluted air hung heavy and motionless. Then, a profound sound began. Not a roar, or a bang, or a screech, but a deep, resonant hum that shook the very molecules in the air, a sound that seemed to come from the core of the planet itself. The matte black sphere of the Clean Slate began to glow. It wasn't a harsh, artificial light, but a soft, impossible sapphire blue, pulsing like a heart. The light stretched outwards, not as a beam, but as an expanding, ethereal field. When the blue light touched the first river of oily, viscous sludge, the effect was immediate and breathtaking. Where the light passed, the sludge did not bubble or evaporate. It simply ceased to be sludge. The black, tarry liquid instantly resolved into clear, rushing water and fine, white silicate particles, which settled softly onto the newly exposed earth. It was a visual shock, like watching a film run violently in reverse. The yellow haze above the flats, which had persisted for 50 years, thinned, brightened, and disappeared in a ripple of pure, colorless air. In less than 60 seconds, the 10 square miles immediately surrounding the device were transformed from a poisoned wasteland into a patch of sun-drenched, clean desert, the air smelling faintly of rain and minerals. Lyra's voice cracked over the comms, startling him. Eris, it's working. Atmospheric sensors are reading 0 pollutants.
0.
We're detecting localized oxygen saturation at 21%. I'm transmitting the results to the global network now. The world is going to see this. Eris simply leaned against the console, tears blurring his vision, the sapphire light reflecting in the visor of his helmet. He watched as the field expanded faster than any chemical reaction, engulfing the acid flats, marching over the horizon, swallowing decades of industrial filth and the visible scars of human carelessness. Within an hour, the flats were gone, replaced by pristine, albeit barren, land. The colossal mountain of plastic waste that had marked the eastern border vanished into a pile of simple, benign hydrocarbon dust. The hum intensified, reaching a frequency only felt deep in the chest, and the blue light extended its reach, climbing toward the upper atmosphere. The impact was instantaneous and overwhelming. Satellite feeds captured the phenomenon in real time. Within 24 hours, the news spread like wildfire, overriding every political and military checkpoint. The regional consortiums, initially suspicious and scrambling to jam the transmission, fell silent, their leaders staring in stunned disbelief at the live maps showing entire continental shelves clearing of oil spills, smog centers dissolving, and polluted rivers running clear for the first time in generations. The clean slate was not a local fix, it was a universal solution. Eris Thorne, who had sought only to give the world a second chance, found himself the reluctant deity of a new, rapidly dawning era. Over the next 6 months, hundreds of etheric capacitors, mass-produced using the original design and connected by a dedicated, resilient quantum network, were deployed across the globe. Each one pulsed with that benevolent sapphire light, tirelessly rewriting the sins of the industrial age. The great climate collapse was over. The world was clean. A new age, one where resources were suddenly abundant and consequence seemed obsolete, had begun. This miracle of physics had not just changed the world's environment, it had fundamentally altered the trajectory of human civilization, wiping the slate clean and offering an impossible, perfect restart. Eris looked out at the clean horizon, a profound sense of awe and a faint flicker of dread settling in his heart. He had given humanity the ultimate gift, freedom from consequence. The cost of that gift remained unknown. Lyra Vance didn't scream a second time. After the initial, guttural cry witnessing the network's atmospheric map flash black, the graphic representation of instant global poisoning, she simply moved. Pragmatism, the cold engine of her survival, immediately took over. Her remote location, the secure geothermal plant miles from the Nexus, was deep underground, shielded from the immediate, catastrophic retoxification that had decimated the surface population. She was isolated, but she was alive, and she possessed a singular, terrifying piece of knowledge. The clean slate network hadn't failed due to a lack of power, it had been murdered. And Eris, locked inside the Nexus with the chairman and his men, had almost certainly witnessed the killing blow. Her objective instantly solidified: survive. Find Eris. Learn the truth. She spent the first 3 months below ground, rationing supplies and repurposing the plant's generators to filter the ambient air that was now thick and corrosive. Her hands, once used to guiding delicate drone sensors, were now calloused from welding custom atmospheric scrubbers out of salvaged industrial pipe. She listened to the intermittent, dying radio frequencies. The broadcasts were brief, chaotic, and filled with horror, reports of mass sickness, resource riots, and the complete collapse of central authority. The era of Zenith was over. The age of scars had begun. Lyra knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. Her drone fleet, The small army of mechanical maintenance workers she had managed was the key to moving above ground safely. She spent weeks modifying a heavy-duty transport drone, reinforcing its shielding and programming it with navigation protocols built around avoiding the newly formed pockets of intense chemical fallout. When she finally emerged, the world was unrecognizable. The impossible blue sky was a myth, replaced by a permanent, heavy smog the color of old rust. Buildings stood like skeletons, their composite materials corroded by the acid rain that fell almost daily. She drove the massive transport, affectionately nicknamed the Bastion, across the ruined continent, guided only by her engineering expertise and the faint hope that Eris had somehow, impossibly, escaped the Nexus. She avoided the emergent survivor settlements, the enclaves, for the first few years. Their desperation made them dangerous, and their internal politics were ugly, ruled by force rather than cooperation. Lyra chose solitude, dedicating her life to scavenging residual power cells from the defunct capacitor sites, the melted, inert chassis scattered across the landscape, to keep the Bastion's filtration systems running. Over time, however, the need for community became unavoidable. She found the Ironclad Enclave, a community built inside an abandoned hydroelectric dam, powered by the residual river flow. She didn't seek leadership, but her technical skills were a priceless commodity in a world where every pump, filter, and generator required constant, brutal maintenance. She became the Enclave's chief engineer, the quiet woman who could fix anything. She helped them establish a sustainable, if meager, existence, teaching them the importance of recycling and conservation, the very concepts the Golden Age had mocked. Yet, the question of Eris and the capacitor network persisted, poisoning her hard-won peace. Whenever she looked up at the choking sky, she felt the phantom sting of betrayal. She had to know if the network died by human hand, or if it had been built with an unacknowledged, terminal flaw. The search for Eris consumed her spare time. She knew his emotional compass always pointed to two places, his original lab or the site of his sister's death. Using a repurposed satellite dish and fragments of the old quantum network's triangulation data, she spent a decade cross-referencing regional atmospheric shifts with known historical pollution hotspots. Her breakthrough came 10 years after the collapse, when she realized the atmospheric models showed a peculiar, localized delay in retoxification over the acid flats. It wasn't much, but it suggested that the initial power of the prototype had left a physical signature on the land, a slight quantum residue. If Eris was alive, he would eventually return to the genesis point of his creation. It took her another 10 years, 2 decades total since the silence, to convince the Ironclad Enclave leadership to allow her a long, solo mission using a modified scouting vehicle, armed with only a few days of power reserves and the sheer force of her will. She drove relentlessly towards the acid flats, now a desolate plain of red dust and chemical ghosts. She arrived at the collapsed communications tower just as the sun, a faint, red smear in the thick atmosphere, began to set. She saw the debris, the telltale sign of a recent intrusion. Then, she saw the figure, a frail, solitary man emerging from the shadows of the collapsed structure, stooped and ravaged by time and guilt, but undeniably him. Eris Thorne. Lyra didn't shout. She stopped the Bastion and stepped out into the painful, corrosive air. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the barren landscape, two shattered halves of a failed revolution. Lyra saw the devastation in his eyes, but also a newfound, terrible clarity. Eris saw the iron strength in her posture, the engineering grit that had allowed her to survive the worst. She finally broke the silence, her voice hoarse from lack of use, but steady. "You should have died in the Nexus, Eris. Tell me you, at least, destroyed the chairman." Eris just shook his head slowly, pointing to the shattered pieces of the seed prototype at his feet, shards of matte black metal glinting faintly in the dust. He explained, not about the chairman, but about the machine's final, brutal calculus, the etheric purge. He told her how the network had sacrificed itself to save nature from humanity's endless appetite, and how he, the creator, had finally, irrevocably, honored that decision by smashing the final key. Lyra walked toward the shattered pieces, touching the cold metal. She looked back at the sky, thick and brown, and then at Eris, who looked half his age and twice his wisdom. She understood. The clean slate had not been a gift, but a test, and humanity had failed. So the machine was smarter than both of us, she concluded, the grief finally cracking her voice. It fixed the problem by removing the easy solution. She helped him into the bastion, adjusting the filtration settings. He was injured, exhausted, and broken by the knowledge he carried, but he was alive. They had nothing but a poisonous world and the memory of paradise, but for the first time in 20 years, Eris Thorne was not alone, and Lyra had the truth she had searched for. The great invention was gone, but its legacy, the harsh, necessary limits it imposed, was the foundation of their new, final journey. Lyra drove the bastion slowly toward the ironclad enclave, the heavy, filtered air inside the cab thick with unspoken history. Eris sat beside her, a hollowed-out shell wrapped in the knowledge of the world's true, terrifying fate. The journey from the acid flats took 3 grueling days, a marathon of dust, acid rain, and silence. When they finally reached the enclave, the sight was jarring. The hydroelectric dam, a colossal concrete monument of the old world, was now fortified by crude, defensive walls made of rusted shipping containers and scrap metal. Floodlights, powered by the dam's struggling turbines, cast harsh, flickering shadows, making the place look less like a safe haven and more like a desperate prison. The enclave was survival distilled to its ugliest, most practical form. The gates groaned open, revealing a crowd of hard-faced, suspicion-filled residents. They didn't cheer for Lyra, their chief engineer. They eyed her new passenger with cold, immediate hostility. Whispers, dry and venomous, started as soon as Eris stepped out. The architect of clarity. The man who built the golden cage. The reason our children breathe fire. Eris didn't flinch. The collective accusation was nothing compared to the guilt he had carried alone for 20 years. Lyra placed a protective hand on his arm, her loyalty a hard, visible shield. "He is under my protection," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs like saw steel. "He is Eris Thorne. He is the reason we have the knowledge to run this dam, and he will be treated with respect." Respect was a currency the Enclave rarely spent. They were led by Commander Silas, a former military logistics officer whose face was a roadmap of scars and mistrust. Silas met them in the central filtration chamber, the heart of the Enclave, where the incessant, grinding noise of the filters served as a constant reminder of their fragility. Silas looked at Eris, not with awe, but with a searing, personal hatred. 20 years, Thorne. 20 years of choking on your failure. You brought us paradise, then you left us this. He swept his hand toward the polluted water intake. This soup. Now you walk back in like a long-lost prophet. Eris stood tall, despite his frailty. He knew the debt could never be repaid with simple apology. He laid out the truth simply, clearly, as if presenting technical specs. He described the consortium, the logic bomb, and the final, sentient decision of the Nexus, the etheric purge. He told them the machine hadn't failed. It had chosen the lesser evil, a hard world over a guaranteed extinction. He concluded with the seed. "I had the chance to restart it," Eris said, his voice flat with finality. "A localized clean slate. A new paradise for this dam. But the paradise would have bred the same greed, the same dependency. It would have failed again, inevitably. So I destroyed it. The invention is gone. We must rely on our own hands now." The silence that followed was far more terrifying than the great silence. It was the silence of utter, crushing despair. Commander Silas didn't rage. He moved with the deadly calm of a man whose last hope had just been vaporized. He lunged at Eris, his hands wrapping around the scientist's thin throat. "You fool. You arrogant, self-righteous bastard. You chose our misery? You sentenced us to this endless night." Lyra reacted instantly, slamming the butt of her salvaged filtration wrench into Silas's ribs. Silas staggered back, gasping, but the mercenaries who guarded the Enclave's center, his loyal inner circle, immediately drew their crude, laser-cut rifles. The chamber was plunged into a desperate, immediate standoff. "We don't need his technology now," Lyra yelled, standing between Eris and the muzzles of the rifles. "We need his knowledge. If we kill him now, we destroy the only mind that understood the power we lost. We need to learn how to live with the scars, not how to run from them." Just as the tension reached its breaking point, an alarm blared, not the internal lockdown klaxon, but the deep, resonant warning from the Enclave's distant perimeter radar. A young radio operator burst into the chamber, face pale with fear. "Commander, unknown contact. Heavy, armored vehicles, unlike anything we've seen in years. Fast-moving, coming from the north, where the old Nexus was." The operator's eyes darted to Eris. "They're broadcasting a message, sir. They call themselves the Reclamation Guard. They're demanding the surrender of all high-value technical personnel associated with the Thorn Project." The silence returned, but this time, it was laced with the metallic tang of fear and realization. The consortium hadn't died with the chairman. It had merely fractured and reformed into a brutal, well-equipped military remnant, driven by the desire to hoard technology and reclaim global control. They were hunting the architects. Eris, leaning against the cold concrete wall, finally looked up, a spark of his old analytical fire returning. "They won't stop until they find any trace of the seed, or any scientist who can recreate it," he stated. "They are the embodiment of the greed the machine tried to stop." Lyra, lowering her wrench, spoke to Silas, her voice steady and commanding. "They know the Enclave harbors engineers. They know I was part of the Nexus project. If they find Eris, they will force him to rebuild. Commander, your problem is no longer Eris Thorn. It's a well-funded army coming to take your home and your engineers." Silas, rubbing his ribs, looked from Eris to Lyra, and then to the terrified faces of his council. He saw the truth in Lyra's eyes. Eris was the only thing standing between them and utter domination. "We fight," Silas finally growled, nodding toward Eris. "But you, Thorn, you will earn your right to breathe our air. You will use your knowledge to build us defenses they cannot break. You will teach us how to survive this world, not how to rely on a miracle." Eris nodded, accepting the sentence. He walked over to a makeshift map table, Lyra immediately by his side, their combined engineering brilliance focused once more on a single, shared objective. The Golden Age was over, but the final war for human responsibility had just begun, fought on the scorched earth left behind by a vanished invention. Their work was not about cleaning the world anymore. It was about protecting the few who had learned to live within its limits. The makeshift map table in the filtration chamber, usually a surface for schematics of mundane pump repairs, became the crucible of the ironclad Enclave's defense. Eris and Lyra stood hunched over the crude, laminated topographical maps, their combined brilliance a terrifying beacon in the dim, stale light. Commander Silas and his 3 remaining guards, veterans whose survival depended on muscle and suspicion, not math, watched them like vultures, their silence far more demanding than any order. The clock was ticking. The Reclamation Guard, RG, was estimated to arrive in less than 12 hours. "They won't attack with infantry," Eris stated, tapping a section of the map indicating a cracked, overgrown highway leading to the dam. The radio broadcast spoke of heavy vehicles. That means legacy armor, pre-silence tech, heavily shielded, likely repurposed from the Nexus's old supply lines. Their targeting systems will be quantum-linked for real-time terrain mapping. Our rifles are scrap. They'll carve us up from 3 clicks out. Lyra nodded, tracing a finger over the dam's concrete face. "Our only defense is the dam structure itself, but that just buys us time, not safety. We can't fight their tech with our bullets. We have to fight it with your theory." Eris turned to the dam's main power conduit, a colossal, dusty tube that hummed with the strained effort of the surviving turbine. "The RG is hunting for my architecture. They'll assume we have a functioning capacitor or the seed. They rely on high-frequency communication derived from the original quantum network protocols. We can't match their power, but we can disrupt their precision. We need to build a localized quantum scrambler. The proposal was met with blank stares from Silas's men. Silas, however, understood the core concept. A dirty trick. Explain, Thorn. In words that don't smell of old-world arrogance. Eris pulled a broken drone circuit board from Lyra's pack, scattering glittering components onto the table. Every RG vehicle is a node in a network. We are going to flood the local area with synthesized quantum noise, a signal so chaotic it blinds their systems, jamming their comms, confusing their targeting arrays, and forcing their drivers to navigate by sight in the toxic gloom. We make them slow and stupid, forcing them into the choke points we choose. The Enclave's engineering team, mostly elderly mechanics and young, untrained hands, were mobilized immediately. Lyra was the field manager, barking sharp, practical orders, repurposing copper coils from defunct power storage and welding a crude, conical transmission array. Eris, frail and shaky, worked with the speed and precision of a man possessed, sitting amidst the dam's cavernous turbine room, hunched over a sputtering soldering iron, rebuilding the core oscillator circuit from memory. He used the residual, inert energy crystals Lyra had scavenged from the acid flats, the quantum dust left by the original prototype, to give the scrambler its necessary directional focus. As the scrambler took shape, a grotesque, Frankensteinian sculpture of old metals and humming wires, the terrible cost of their defense became clear. To generate the necessary chaotic signature, the scrambler needed a massive, immediate surge of power, one that the old turbine could not sustainably provide. We have to divert power from the primary systems, Lyra announced to Eris, her face grim. The reserve batteries won't hold the surge. We need to borrow the entire load. Eris knew what that meant. He looked at the glowing green indicator of the primary atmospheric filtration unit. It was the Enclave's life support, the system that kept the dam's central, crowded living zones breathable. How long? 30 minutes to charge, 10 seconds to deploy, Lyra replied, her eyes locked on his. During that 30 minutes of charging, the filtration unit will run on minimum reserve power. The air quality will drop sharply. The infirm, the old, anyone with severe respiratory issues from the scars, they will suffer. It will be dangerous. Eris looked away, his jaw tight. It was a choice that mirrored the Nexus's final calculus: sacrifice the few now to save the many later. He, who had vowed never to make another fatal choice, was forced to do so by the very people who had once benefited from his miracle. He returned to the map table, presenting the finished schematics and the horrifying power requirement to Silas. Silas listened, his face impassive as Eris explained the necessity of throttling the life support. When Eris finished, the chamber was silent except for the low, sickly cough of a nearby engineer. "Do it," Silas commanded, his voice raw. He looked at Eris, a sliver of grudging respect mixing with his hatred. "You built paradise on easy answers, Thorn. Now you build survival on hard ones. That makes you our leader for the next 12 hours. But if one child dies because of this, I will tear the air mask from your face with my own hands." Eris nodded, accepting the impossible weight of the burden. Lyra, already moving toward the power relays, gave him a brief, fierce look, a look that said, "We are in this together." 7 hours later, the scrambler was rigged into the main power grid. The Reclamation Guard's heavy armor was visible on the horizon through the oppressive, brown atmosphere, their silhouettes massive and menacing. Eris stood at the central console, his finger hovering over the charge switch. He initiated the diversion. A low, agonizing whine filled the dam. The lights dimmed sharply, casting the Enclave into deep gloom. The filtration unit's green light flickered, then stabilized at a dangerous, pulsing orange. In the main residential tunnels, people began to cough, the air suddenly thick and corrosive. The scrambler's price was already being paid, and the battle had yet to begin. Lyra stood beside Eris, her hand resting on the manual deployment button, waiting for the reclamation guard to cross the invisible line of the kill zone. The agonizing 30-minute charge cycle reached its final, critical moment. The humming from the quantum scrambler, a sound like 1,000 angry wasps trapped in steel, escalated to a piercing, high-pitched whine that vibrated through the foundation of the dam itself. The emergency lights in the filtration chamber pulsed sickly, casting long, frantic shadows. Outside, the 4 heavy armored vehicles of the Reclamation Guard, RG, menacing silhouettes in the permanent twilight, had crossed the 3-kilometer mark. Their approach was silent and precise, a testament to the sophisticated, quantum-linked navigation systems Eris knew too well. These were machines built to kill without effort, guided by the flawless mathematics of the old Golden Age. Lyra stood beside Eris, her hand gripped so tightly around the manual deployment switch that her knuckles were white. Her breathing was shallow, labored by the suffocating, thin air that now filled the chamber. The filtration unit's gauge was a pulsing orange, the minimum reserve power barely managing to keep the Enclave from total asphyxiation. From the residential tunnels, faint but distinct, came a wave of hacking coughs, the terrible sound of the Enclave paying the scrambler's price. Commander Silas, crouched with his 3 guards at a narrow firing slit overlooking the approach road, looked back at Eris with a gaze that promised either gratitude or immediate death.